this is a Doomer Optimist podcast. I don't know what episode number it's going to be, but we should just introduce ourselves. I'm Travis Logan. I write as post-level book reviews on Substack. I was on a previous podcast with Ashley and a guy named R. John Williams, who's a professor at Yale. We had a good conversation. And then I'm not 100% sure why. Maybe because you and I had talked a little bit in a little group chat that we're in with her, Charles and I, about this book that Charles has been reading by David Bentley Hart, who is a kind of liberal, or I would say I guess he's a left Anglican kind of intellectual.
He's Eastern Orthodox, but yeah, he's out there.
I thought he was Anglican.
He grew up Episcopalian.
Oh, I see. Okay, all
right. Yeah.
But I think one of his philosophical commitments is Christian, but another, I think he's also a very big left wing guy. Right? Am I wrong about that?
Pinning him down is hard. There are topics where yes, he is left wing. Yeah, I would.
Yeah. That way. Fine. Anyway, so he has written this very dense, and I actually found kind of infuriating and obnoxious book. I was not able to finish it because I first of all, I don't have the context to understand these things, but I absolutely hated the style, and I basically hated the book. But and I'm glad to talk about that. It's about theory of consciousness and whether or not these things are kind of reducible to material particles or not. I guess I'm kind of getting away from the point here. So I am a guy who reviews books. I'm going to turn it over to Charles to introduce himself right now.
Okay, so I'll introduce myself and then we can talk about the book a bit later too. So not an introduction to the book. I'm Charles. We're in DC right now. We're just outside the swamp in Maryland. I'm finishing a PhD, not related to artificial intelligence, and so don't tell my advisor that I'm doing this. What else to say? I mean, I've been interested in technology and politics and philosophy and theology for a long time. So depending on what crowd I'm in, I'll say I'm a linguist or I'm a theologian or a nerd or what have you. So I like to some sort of pretense to not a Renaissance man, but at least a high-end dilettante.
Nice. And Han, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. Charles, I like your framing of a sort of a high-end dilettante because I think it's the right sort of mix of curiosity and humility. I think that resonates with me. To summarize, myself and my writing, I'm A.R.X. Han. Of course, that's a pseudonym. I'm a Chinese American writer, and my debut novel, Incel, I would describe as a sort of biomaterialist tragic comedy about the sort of journey of a young incel, but it is, as Travis said earlier, very much inflected with this very kind of detailed examination of neuroscientific reductionism and these like you, Charles. I'm not an academic. I believe you're a graduate student in theology rather than analytic philosophy. And myself, I once considered going to graduate school for philosophy, but never ended up taking that route. So I am, in that regard, more of a kind of enthusiastic dilettante in the way that perhaps you described yourself.
And Han, you came to fiction, if I heard right on a different podcast, through philosophy. Am I right about that?
Yeah. It's a really kind of interesting. It was a very kind of backwards journey, in that in the beginning I was very taken by a lot of philosophical questions, existential questions, like many young men. The personal context for this was I had a friend of mine who took his life when we were both very young men. It was very tragic. It was also very disturbing to me. and that kind of activated an interest in philosophy. But then I realized that I didn't think that I had much to say in philosophical terms. I was more so consuming interesting arguments rather than producing, novel ideas. And then at the same time, I had this impulse to create, and narrative fiction just became a kind of natural fit incrementally over time.
So I think it's important to position Han there, because within the larger conversation that we're about to have, he is, yes, a author of fiction, but for people who haven't read his book, it is very deeply philosophical. I would say it's primarily a work of fiction. It's not like, say, Thus Spake Zarathustra or something, where it's like or the book we're about to talk about, which is, it's kind of like a work of philosophy that has fictional elements to it. His is on the other side, where it's heavily philosophical, but it is primarily fiction. Anyway, we should probably try and orient our conversation to the Doomer Optimist audience, who are largely interested in kind of technology, and as Ashley or Paul Kingsworth would call it, like kind of the machine, and the kind of the way that humanity and spirituality is being just consumed by mechanistic kind of computational, kind of ideas about what it means to be human. Anyway, so I think that Charles should probably, to begin this conversation, is maybe describe. He's written a really beautiful book review for the New Atlantis, and maybe he wants to kind of give us an explanation of what's going on in his book review and of David Bentley Hart's book. What is it? What reminds it?
All things are full of gods. Which sounds like a really cool band name to me sometimes. Like a dark metal band.
Right. Black Emperor or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'll try and give a summary. I mean, like you said, Travis, the book is huge. So Hart, I'll try and situate Hart quickly, and then the book, and then we can narrow down to the sliver of the book that I sort of was especially interested in. So Hart is a theologian, cultural critic. He is known in a bunch of circles. Before writing this book, he wrote a few books, like on philosophy of mind as like a particular area in the philosophical conversation that he's interested in. This book was sort of advertised as part of that conversation, but when you open the cover and you start reading through, you realize this is way more than philosophy of mind. He covers integrated information theory, he covers thermodynamics, he covers panpsychism, he covers quantum physics, RNA and DNA. So that was one thing that sort of cued me in, that his beef is bigger now. He's not just criticizing a sort of particular conversation in philosophy. It's more like the whole scientific and technological project of the last few centuries that he takes aim at. He doesn't spend a lot of the time working on a sort of genealogy of error. So he doesn't sort of date stuff to like this this is where it started, and before then it was pristine, and after it's all garbage. He's not truly concerned in that, but it's pretty clearly something in the last few centuries that kicked all this off. So he's trying. You could think of the book as sort of the last word, the final word on a debate about materialism. And he's written a lot against materialism, and this is the book where he is taking off the gloves and sort of saying it's just absurd. Like the whole prospect of materialism just doesn't hold water. But he thinks that materialism has infected every nook and cranny of the way that we think, the way that we build the world. There's so many applications to his thought that you could take towards like economics, politics, pretty much anywhere, because we're so ingrained in a sort of materialist framework. So that's the large project of the book. A small part of that, he talks about large language models, and I mean, I mentioned this to Travis and at a conference we were at together. One of the big questions with large language models is sort of, is there some sort of principled limit to their capacity? And so, like a typical conversation about AI LLMs is, it's clever, but it can't do this. And then the other person across the table goes, well, it can't do it yet. Give it time. And then another iteration comes out, and lo and behold, it can do that thing. It's like, well, shucks. Well, okay, fine. It can do that, but it surely can't do this. And the other guy across the table just sips his beer and goes, yet. You're like, gosh darn it. Like, what, when are we going to find that end? And so the sort of principled limit has been a challenge to discover. I think Hart suggests a pretty decent limit to these things. Part of it has to do with the fact that it's a sort of, it leans on mathematics, which is sort of the language that LLMs can understand. It's not purely metaphysical or philosophical. I mean, the book is definitely that, but when he addresses these things, he points to a sort of mathematical limit. It goes something like this. You have sort of two things going on when you read a text. You have the meaning of the text, and his example that he gives in the book is Anna Karenina. So when you start off with the book, you don't know a whole lot. The meaning is not very clear. The characters' faces are sort of foggy and not very high def. But as you go through the book, by the end of the 700th page or something, everything has become very clear. His word for this is determinate, but the idea is that everything becomes sort of high res. The characters, their inner life, their actions, the meaning of the whole thing over time, as you read it, it becomes clearer and clearer, more determinate.
Can we just stop for 1 second?
Yeah.
Is that when you read that book? I've never read that book, but I have listened to War and Peace, and many other I've read and listened to many other quite long books. Is that your experience with long works of fiction, to have a higher definition understanding of, like, let's say what the character looks like by the end of it?
I would say so. I would say yeah. I mean, if I were writing it or defending it, my like go-to would be something like Moby Dick, where just the quality of the characters just becomes so crystalline by the end of it. Ahab is this mysterious figure. We don't know a lot about him. As we go on through his actions, through his words, we just see, we know the man more.
It's not super my experience. Like, I become familiar with the characters as like a vibe and as like almost amorphous things, but like I don't have an image in my mind of like what Ahab's nose looks like. I don't, for like Starbuck, or like I don't have, and that's actually a thing. Like in my own writing, I do actually try and give detail like that, because I think often as a novel goes on, we just rely more on what the character, so I just use them by name, and there is anyway. So but I don't my mind doesn't form like a super high definition image. But anyway, Han, if you're back, I'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from
Yeah. So I found the argument in the book a little bit tricky for a number of reasons. So I think I think actually he sort of collapses a couple of different arguments together.
Did you read the
and
book?
Then, no, I'm just as described in the article. Just as described in the article. I didn't read the book. I read Charles's summation of the argument. But with regard to the LLM piece, I think he's arguing, on the one hand, he's saying LLMs cannot write literary fiction on the level of, it's like a superb human, prose craftsman or something like that, right? So we already know this is empirically true, right? So this is provably true, like given the current state of the art, right? So that's one argument. So I think that's more of an observation. And then I think the second thing he's saying is that um, this technology could never produce a work of art like that, even if they throw more compute at it, even if they throw more data at it, and so on, right? And so I think there's kind of these, like, there's an observation and an argument here, right? And I think these things kind of get a little bit confused here, and that's what I didn't really like about this. And then the third thing that I would say here is just like a framing kind of device, which is that, I am a priori skeptical of, I mean, I don't know this fellow's background, but I'm just, as a non-technical person myself, and I know a bunch of people who've worked with ML systems and stuff like this. I think, you know, to a certain extent, the word cells kind of have to admit that they don't understand these technical systems.
Yeah.
And so it gets really hard to just, predict what will be possible in 5 to 10 years. The answer is nobody knows, right? And I would not weigh the prediction of a non-subject matter expert in terms of extrapolating the capabilities curve for these systems. Uh, there's a very, very wide array of questions here. I've seen people argue that LLMs will um, not be the path to AGI, rather, but that they will be a reasoning engine that sits within a broader kind of artificial mental structure that has other components. And my understanding of the way that these things work is basically that they can do limited generalization. So basically, what it's doing is it's Ted Chiang has argued that these are just like a compression of text, essentially. But then other people argue, no, it's not a quote unquote stochastic parrot. It can do limited generalization. You can go to one of these machines. I'll give you an example, and you can prompt it to write a prose description of a scene in the style of Cormac McCarthy or in the style of Michelle Welbeck, and it will do a sort of undergraduate level version of that clearly falls short of the standard. Theoretically, I have also at the same time heard that if they had enough data labelers to label high quality prose fiction, that these models would actually get better at that. It's just that there's little economic incentive to do that, basically, when writers will work for free to begin with. So
Right.
I think my concern with the argument, just in general, is that it seems like an argument as to why LLMs cannot produce lengthy, logically coherent texts, and that already seems demonstrably false, because we already know they can produce lengthy, logically coherent texts, because the argument he makes doesn't hit narrative. It hits like coherence. He's saying that no such, like, it can't write long coherent pieces of text. That was my understanding. So I have to say I was quite skeptical about this kind of, to me, what felt just like something that was rather muddled.
I actually agree with Han here, even though, like, Hart is very much speaking for me here. Like, I want him to be right, in terms of what I listened to of the book and what I'm reading in your article, especially this bit about, I'm looking at your article right now. Oh yeah, this bit about, like, kind of like whether or not the brain is just a kind of predictive machine.
Mhm.
And his claim is, like, one thing about good writing is that we can't anticipate what's going to happen next. And so, I think, to read your exact words here, but we could not guess what they will say next. Good writing is an endless, widening surprise, disclosing something about the world we had somehow never noticed, shaping us long after we have read it. I mean, like, that is true. But I actually had an experience with GPT-4 this morning, where maybe it was yesterday morning, where I've been kind of thinking about the incoming Trump administration. I've been thinking about like its relationship to the humanities, and I've been like, what are they going to do with the National Endowment of the Arts, with the National Endowment of the Humanities? Are they just going to cut it? And I'm asking GPT-4, like, what are some, um, like ideas for like, that these agencies could do? And it came up with these like, frankly, wonderful and like surprising and like kind of like changing my, kind of like orienting me to a new ideas that I wouldn't have imagined. And I was kind of like, I don't believe in personhood here for the machine, but just this test of like, can this thing produce like new ideas that are like I wouldn't have expected? The answer for me, at least, and maybe I'm kind of an idiot, was yes. Quite recently.
Yeah. So a few things to unpack. So on the, I mean, from what you just read, the keyword there might be endless.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so one of the things that Hart claims, and I think he's right on this. I mean, there's a lot of like there's a lot of background to this in the rest of the book that we might need to go into, but he keeps using this term, and I forget if in the quote that I chose that got into the final edit whether he uses this term, but he keeps describing sort of uh, text, sort of the order of words on the page. He describes them as several times in the book as aperiodic, so sort of, in other words, patternless. And so, in terms of the, if you get to a certain, so this goes to Han's point a little bit about like large, uh, like novel sort of styles. Um, I mean, one question is like, you don't have in those novels a periodic form of writing is part of what Hart is getting at. Is you don't have like the way that the words are ordered on the page is like strictly speaking patternless.
It's not like iambic pentameter or something like that. You mean?
Well, that would not quite like that. It's not the meter. It's just
the content of the words. There's
like
no,
if you have to sort of strip away, and this is hard to do, but you have to sort of strip away the fact that they mean something for you to sort of see this. So like an easy version is like turn a page upside down and like stare at it, and you notice like they're like you sort of get a moment, a sort of phenomenological moment of like, oh yeah, they're like this doesn't look patterned.
Mhm.
And that's what he's trying to point out is as sort of the material on the page is not a pattern. And he does mention there might be like local apparitions of patterns. But at at this sort of endless scale, as things grow in size, the thing itself is aperiodic. The thing itself is patternless. So when you encounter something in like, your conversation with ChatGPT, like one sort of question is the endless, whether it could endlessly do that. And the other is the fact that whatever it gives you um, is pattern generated. And so
Why?
at scale, that's just like the mathematics of it. Like and Han actually pointed out a really important point. This isn't in the piece, but this is a key sort of limit to Hart's point. And Han, you might be able to speak to this more. So this does address LLMs, but there are more AI models than there are in your philosophies. Um, LLMs, the way they function is at rock bottom a sort of predictive statistical analysis. Um, it's a misnomer to think that it's only next word prediction. There are other things that um, give the weights preference towards some words or phrases and against others than just the fact that those words are found together. That to mean there are lots of like expensive. They hire a bunch of people to say, all right, here's some sentences. Which one would you prefer to see? So this is called RLHF, reinforcement learning through human feedback, and it's very expensive. And it also makes for some fairly comical outcomes, like in Google's Gemini when it became kind of woke. Because that's what people preferred. That was the RLHF layer in the predictive model. But it is at rock bottom, it is a statistical analysis of words, and so it can only reproduce to you things that it has found according to some sort of pattern. And so like inherently, it doesn't even try to feed you patternless language, which is Hart's argument that that's fundamentally how language works. At the material level on the page, it's patternless until and
do you agree with this point here?
yeah,
Yeah, I think so. The short answer is no. When I read the argument, I was confused because I thought I was misunderstanding it because it didn't really make any sense to me because it seemed to me from the excerpt in Charles's review that he sort of is making a general argument as to why an LLM could never work. And that's how the argument actually read to me. And so I had the impression when I was reading the argument that, this is a guy who's pointing to a plane in the sky and saying that's impossible. Because again, it's the examples he takes are from fiction, but the argument he makes generalizes to any sort of lengthy text that is coherent. Like, saying, for example, that there's no pattern in the text. Well, that doesn't make any sense to me. A sentence is a pattern, right? Like
subject, verb,
it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think what he's kind of doing is, I think he's sort of making a kind of derivative argument of John Searle's Chinese argument room from years and years ago, which you guys may be familiar. Charles, I would imagine I see nodding, so you're familiar with that. But basically, there was this thought experiment from well before LLMs. This American philosopher named John Searle, he said, imagine a situation where you have a guy sitting in a room. He doesn't read or understand a word of Chinese, but if you just give him a set of instructions which are extremely complicated, and then you feed him these characters, can he translate them, into English and understand it? I'm paraphrasing here. There's some additional nuance, and I think the intuition that I think Hart is leaning on is this intuition that I think the implicit intuition is / question is, can a non-conscious system understand semantic meaning, right? Or can a non-conscious system understand text, right? And I think our intuition when we think about understanding is that understanding is not merely a mechanical computation, but I think that when we think about understanding, we think of understanding as having a computation element and also a subjective element. Like there's a subjective feeling of a kind of click, a subjective experience of apprehending a particular relationship between different variables and so forth. So I think what he's kind of doing here, in my view, is sort of kind of presenting a sort of variation of that argument that to me seems a little bit weaker. And it's a bit confused because I think what's uniquely disturbing about large language models is this idea that can a large language model produce a beautiful piece of prose that actually moves a human being without ever being conscious in doing so, like it's just happening in silico. And I think that is profoundly disturbing. And so it's not surprising to me that a theist would react very negatively to the philosophical implications of AGI or artificial superintelligence, even, right? I think these are, in my view, and apologies, maybe I'm broadening it out too much, but I do think these are potentially almost catastrophic, events for the modern theist, like potentially, right? Almost the story of, perhaps even, the story of creation in reverse, right? So anyway, sorry, I can be a bit discursive, but I just,
No.
that didn't land for me. That saying, you present a dichotomy of there's no pattern, or it's Dostoevsky, and there's nothing in between.
Hey, wait, Charles, before you respond to this, because I know you probably are going to, but Han, can you just explain how you say sentences are all patterns? Do you mean that in a kind of subject verb, like grammatical sense, or what's the patterning you're seeing there?
Yeah, I think a sentence is a pattern because it contains like semantic meaning, basically, slash syntactic meaning. I think it contains both types of meaning, basically, right? So to me, I actually don't understand at all how you could describe a sentence as not containing a pattern. Like, a sentence is a type of it's a unit. It's like an atomic unit of,
My
or maybe the alphabet. Yeah.
My understanding what you're saying is that looking at the page without assigning meaning to the words, you're not really seeing a pattern. And the meaning, like basically the meaning as interpreted by the machine is just like kind of assigned by by a human, presumably. Am I saying this right, Charles?
Yeah, that's sort of the point that make is like uh one way to think about it might be, where is the pattern? So I think Han is right that there is a pattern there, but where is it? And it's not in the physical bits, as Hart would say. It's not in the quanta. It's not in the things on the page. And this is a hard thing to uh, this is a hard distinction to make, because we're sort of meaning creating creatures, and so it's I mean, I put it in the article. It's like, once you see a pattern in something, it's damn near impossible to unpattern that. Um, but prior to you giving the pattern, the example I give is like, there's this tree in my backyard, right, or backyard of my parents' place, and it was just a tree trunk until one day I saw a withered man's face in it. Sort of caricature of a withered man's face. After that, it's really hard for me to unsee that, to sort of unsee the form once it's been sort of donated to the thing. So you have to think of something um, where the fact that it does mean something, the fact that it has been given pattern from the mind, um, is less obvious to you. Um, you could do this in all sorts of things. Pick a tree trunk that you've never really paid attention to before, and then see what you notice in the tree trunk. And like, the moment you see withered man's face or whatever, it's that the moment prior to seeing some meaning in the tree trunk that Hart is pointing out when he says there is no pattern. That the material stuff, that's not where the pattern exists. It exists in the mind, and then the mind gives he has this fancy schmancy way of putting it, but the pattern and the meaning doesn't exist sort of within the material stuff, but it's they're sort of, this is a bad paraphrase, and Hart would spank me, but um, they're sort of vessels that outside of the mind don't possess that. So think of like a tree falling in the forest, no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Hart would say no, emphatically it does not. In the same way, if there's an AI engine out there producing, doing statistical analysis and, throwing up a bunch of text, and there's no one there to read it, uh, there's no meaning happening to the thing. It's the tree trunk that hasn't been seen yet, and so it's as random or as meaningless as the tree trunk is. Um, that's the idea.
I ask it, so Han, kind of building on what Charles is saying here, what's your interpretation of this kind of the ability of the AI to engage in kind of meaning making, independent that kind of human qualia that's doing the kind of whatever is happening in the human mind that is creating meaning?
Well, I think what's interesting to me is one argument you can make is that it's almost like this meaning transducer. So let me be precise in what I say there. Uh,
What
the
is
LLMs,
is the meaning transducer?
the LLM is a meaning transducer.
Okay, got it. Yep.
So when I use the term transducer, I think of this kind of like as almost like a pipe or a conduit. That's the sense in which I use that term. So, you have this enormous library of text that was produced by conscious human beings using some combination of conscious reasoning and unconscious, neurological computation. You assemble all of that. You feed it into this, data center. The data center, builds the land. Train. The model is trained on that data inside the data center. That's the transducer component, and then you query the model, and what it reflects back to you through these unconscious in silico computations is a piece of text, which, as Charles then says, and then you apprehend the text, you consciously apprehend the text, and then the meaning is almost reactivated. It reappears in your mind, right? That's, I think, one way of looking at it, right?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was kind of processing what you're saying as you're saying. Maybe I'm just slow here, but I'm sorry. So you're saying the steps after the kind of data center. You're saying, can you just walk me through that one more time? So that the LLM is trained on a lot of data we have in a data center. I'm not clear where we're going after this.
Yeah. So uh, I, to I'll kind of reframe that a little bit. I think the original question was, can LLMs produce meaningful text, or how do they produce meaningful text if they can do that, right? And what I'm saying is that um, because they're trained on human text,
Yep.
they have this ability to do limited generalization on this from that data set.
Mm-hmm.
When you type a query into ChatGPT and it produces an answer, the chips themselves are not conscious, so the chips are not consciously apprehending the meaning of that text. But that text, when presented to you as a human user, is then is then received by you as a kind of visual stimulus,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you process that in your brain, and then you're conscious of the meaning of that internally, and so the meaning sort of the meaning originally starts in this giant corpus of human produced text where it's transcribed.
This
It
is the transducer.
seemingly disappears through the transducer of the data center that's unconscious because it's just in silica, and then you read it, and then it sort of magically reappears, in your mind, sort of thing. So it's, but you could say the same is true of writing in general, right? So like
Well,
I, yeah,
I think what Charles is saying though is that there's this essential element of being able to create meaning that the human is able to do, but the LLM is not. Am I paraphrasing you correctly here, Charles? Can you hear me? Yeah, you're on mute, Charles. If you're
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean,
and Han, do you have a theory? Do you have a kind of an interpretation on that? Like, is this ability to make meaning kind of bound up with the notion of personhood, in your view? Am I right here? Am I on the right track here, Charles?
um, well, maybe if it's directed to Han, I mean, I had a sort of similar question to that to Han. Han, I might have misheard. I might have misheard. You mentioned something. Um, so you have meaning in sort of the corpus of human language goes to the transducer, where it's sort of the meaning is suspended or absent in some significant way, pops out the other end, we apprehend it, and then it's meaningful again. Um, I I don't know that Hart wouldn't say that the meaning even exists in the corpus of texts, because the corpus of text is, in some sense, it's the same stuff that is spit out the other end. It's the same sort of material signs, but the meaning, and this is where we might have to get we might have to talk about what we think is going on in our heads as well, because for him the meaning exists like meaning is immaterial fundamentally. Matter can represent meaning to us. It can alert us to meaning. We can assign meaning to matter, but it's never the locus. It's never the place where that it's neither causal nor like permanently receptive of meaning outside of a mind giving it meaning. So I just wanted to. I didn't know if you had if I misunderstood the transducer imagery or if something else was happening.
Yeah, so let me expand on that. The transducer imagery is more, I think, kind of like an illustrative example of this argument that you just made, Charles. Who Hart which the argument which Hart made essentially, right? And I think what Hart is basically saying is that there's a difference between information, which can exist in the absence of a conscious mind perceiving something. There's a distinction between information and a distinction between meaning. And I think what Hart is saying is that meaning is something that can only really be directly apprehended or experienced by a conscious mind. So to answer your question, Travis, I view it less in terms of quote unquote personhood, which I think is sort of wedded to the, species of hominids, and perhaps just expand that to, just conscious agents in general, let's say. And so I think, the broader argument here is that, yes, there's something special about consciousness. Yes, there are, things like qualia, right? What is it? What does the color red look like to a conscious agent?
Right.
What is it like to be a bat? To reference a paper from Thomas Nagel, right? And all of that is stuff that that I agree with. And again, he's kind of beating up on LLMs right now, and that's perfectly fine. I think the the pressing question really basically is sort of like how good will these things get, and are they going to hit a limit? And it sort of looks like they're sort of leveling off now. And then the more expansive question is, of course, can something instantiated in silica achieve consciousness? And how would we even know, given the problem of other minds that applies, just between human beings to begin with? So, those I think just nobody knows the answer to those questions. They're enormously important. They're incredibly important questions that we simply don't have an answer to at this moment in history.
Why do you say? I feel like I appreciate your view. I've read your writing on this subject in other places. I share a lot of your views, or certainly understand them. But I actually don't feel depressed by the idea of LLMs kind of surpassing human artists. Why are you depressed by that? I mean, Charles, if you want to chime in too, whatever.
I was gonna ask you why you're not depressed, but
I think it's just exciting. I'm kind of like, I think it's like, I like competition. Not in some like Ronald Reagan, Milton Friedman way, but I like it in a like. I frankly don't think there are that many good writers out there, or maybe there are a lot, but they're working on different things. And when I find another writer that I think is doing a good job, like for instance Han, I'm kind of just like, oh wow, I can't believe I found this like rare and valuable commodity. And I of course I'm a Catholic, and I certainly do like personhood and this kind of the element of qualia. That's like it's like super important to me. Um, but just the idea of like of more high quality artistic production just seems like really optimistic um, thing to me, rather than something, because I don't make a living doing this. And I think a lot of the people that do make a living doing it like are terrible, and they're not even. I think the point. I mean, I think the point of good fiction is to capture qualia. and to kind of represent it and prove that this is a phenomenon. And there's a point in your review here, Charles, where you're saying Hart is kind of worried about an existence purged of whatever the mechanical outlook cannot explain. And kind of central to my worldview is like the point of fiction is to be constantly proving, hey, there is this immaterial, and the way we capture it is through language. And if a machine is able to do that as a byproduct of being trained by millions of people doing that, trying to do that themselves, I'm kind of like, wow, like the machine is doing something I wanted to do. Maybe I'm wrong there.
I'm curious, Han, how if you want to expand on the your we might be on the same page on this. So I'm curious what you meant by depressed or some sort of anxiety related to this.
Yeah, so Travis is referencing some of the blog posts I've written about the topic, and certainly it's a topic that interests me a great deal. Probably because I've spent perhaps too much of my life trying to sort of compulsively perfect a given sentence in a novel that I self-published on Amazon, right? And I'm a huge fan of Travis's book reviews. I think they're very well thought out. I think they're very they're very serious and rigorous in a way that I think elevates the entire kind of indie lit space, as it were. But to answer the question at hand, uh, I can certainly see a situation where there's some ambiguity here. I can certainly imagine a situation where these capabilities approximate human capabilities, and because they only approximate human capabilities, human beings in general are not enfeebled by this new species of agents that exists in the world, right? And yes, if they can produce incredibly beautiful, moving art, that it will be compelling on its own terms. I think that's sort of tautologically true.
Yeah.
But I think as I play through various thought experiments, about this, in my head, one thought experiment that's occurred to me is this idea of what I call kind of the alphabetical basilisk. I've been meaning to write about this, but imagine a scenario where we take a human being and we do neuroimaging on a human being, very, very high fidelity neuroimaging that maps that person's mind and their experiences and their personality and all these other things. And then we feed that into a kind of superhuman intelligence, and it outputs, a novel that is, in a sense, perfectly optimized for that individual human being.
I'm surprised you're making this example here, based on your character Rachel at the end of your book here.
Oh, sorry. I'm just going to turn my. I'm getting a phone call. I'm going to turn.
Charles, at the end of his book, the sister character, who's a kind of philosophical foil for his protagonist, kind of takes psychology to task for kind of not being a serious science, and when you're looking at these scans of brains, all you're really seeing is kind of areas of the brain light up, but it's like it's not precise. It's very difficult to like determine what's going on just because there's like a heat map showing that there's some neural activity here or neural activity there. It's not particularly, it's not precise. Am I wrong about that, Han?
Yeah. So the point with the thought experiment is not that this would be possible now.
Okay.
But so it's purely just an extrapolation into the future, right? And basically the idea that I was getting at is, how would you feel about an incredibly moving work of art that was built by a non-conscious system? And that to me is a very peculiar sort of thing to think about. And let me expand on that argument a little bit more. One of my contentions, and I've been thinking about this more and more lately, as more and more people talk about the advent of AI agents, right? So LLMs are not truly agentic, That's one thing that's that's an incredibly important thing to mention, right? We know that they're not truly agentic unless you lower them into some other superstructure that kind of makes them pseudo-agentic, right? But my contention is that a vast swaths of human meaning are downstream from agentic competition. So I'm going to repeat that because it's sort of a weird thing to think about. But the idea here is that
what do you mean by downstream?
Yeah, so contingent on, contingent
Okay.
on. So what I mean to say here is that a lot of things in life that a person finds meaningful are in fact an expression of competition between similarly capable agents. So I'll just give you an example. Let's imagine a classic hero's journey, a Campbellian journey, right? You have this guy, he's fighting adversity, he defeats the adversity, and then there's a sort of victory condition, and then that becomes a source of personal meaning, right? Well, that event is only possible because of kind of broadly similar levels of agentic capability, i.e., it actually is the result of competition, right? And this and so the same is in some sense true of the arts, right? You and I probably don't spend a lot of time reading fan fiction or about Twilight or whatever this or that, but we want to read the greats, right? And what makes the greats important is, of course, the fact that they competed with other agents in the production of art. Now, yes, that art is meaningful and compelling on its own terms, but it is nonetheless situated in this context that is comparative, right? And so, if we imagine a scenario where AI agents substantially exceed the capabilities of the average human being or even smarter human beings, to me, that feels like removing a foundational block of meaning generation across broad swaths of a human being's life. Because you start to be able to substitute, it makes it impossible to compete on any of these axes.
Is that kind of already happening with
Yeah.
phone? I'm a public school teacher. It's very difficult for text to compete with TikTok, which is kind of algorithmically designed to get the attention of specific.
Or if you go with I think this thought experiment is yeah, haunting. And I think in a small way I see this with like my undergrad students, right? Where there's been a lot written on this recently too, where the availability to like ChatGPT means that students they don't know that it's cheating to use it. So there's this one side where they're like, this is just going to a friend or something like that. So that cheating is breaking down. Cheating is an old world concept that needs to be updated. But also the students, there's a sort of motivation problem with students. Like if the thing can produce a text that is in parity with what I could produce, if not a little bit better, why am I writing the thing in the first place? What why am I here? And so I think if I understand the idea correctly, Han, there is the motivation there to think for oneself, to process for oneself, at least at the undergrad level, um, and probably in the grad level too, to some extent, is faltering. It's enfeebled at this point.
Yeah, and to follow up on your point, Travis, right? I think a lot of us, might, perhaps not yourself, because I think maybe you're a purist in this respect, but I think many professional writers look back on, let's say this period from, I don't know, maybe the 30s to the 80s or even 90s as this, this golden period where, they were you could have this huge impact in the culture when a paperback book was the equivalent of a smartphone. You know, when everybody was talking about, you know, the latest Updike or Roth book novel or etc. Right, and then you know, I spend a lot of time on Substack, for better and for worse, and it's almost like this continuous sort of wailing lamentation of like, oh man, why can't we have magazine parties again? Why can't we have the literary rat pack again, right? Why can't we, and I think, there is this doomerism, that is, I think, pervasive among, the sort of, word cell cast of which perhaps we're all members, right? And I think, yes, you can kind of situate that in, well, we don't matter as much as in the broad meta competition of culture creation and consumption as we used to, right? And now that's not the only reason I think that we're kind of in this downswing, but I see that.
Oh, you're muted, Hon.
Oh yeah, no, sorry. I said I just see that as a theme. Yeah.
Charles, do you feel like you're writing, like you're gonna make money on your writing one day?
Do I feel that way?
Or do you hope for that?
That'd be great. That'd be awesome. Yeah, I think
I hope you do.
to sort of flesh out Han's image. Another concern that I have, or sort of share with Hart, is so he talks about these different fallacies of materialism, and you don't have to go far into the book to get them all. It's pretty early on, but one of them that touches on some of the stuff that Han was speaking on is he calls the Narcissan fallacy, and this it goes like this: um, if you're tempted to see in these systems a sort of consciousness, like Travis, when you mentioned like there's no denying that it gives you ideas, and you're like, gosh, I did not see that before. That's interesting. And so those sorts of moments can lead one to be tempted to think like, okay, there is something behind this, and that something sure seems similar, if not identical, to what I do in my head. And Hart is concerned that as these systems are sort of in the water, they become sort of mundane to us. That instead of projecting consciousness onto them, which might be an initial feeling, um, the long-term consequence will be that we will actually become like them. That sort of in believing that they have consciousness, we will actually sort of imitate and turn into them. So like he talks about the myth of Narcissus. He looks at a reflection. He's enamored with it. It's a hot guy down there. It's super. He can't take his eyes away. And at the end of the story, Narcissus, in one rendering, he turns into a flower. He turns into the material object that he's been enamored with.
Daffodil, I think, right? Is that what Narcissus is?
Yeah, I think so. And so that's another sort of long term. And I don't actually think that the systems have to get all that much better for that trajectory to play out, where we believe in the machine, that there's some sort of consciousness, but in what actually happens is we believe more and more in the long run that we are just machines, that we are just like that thing. And
we kind of already have run. I think we already have this issue in society.
Oh yeah.
Well, but it's actually, I think it's actually more related to animals and pets, where people, and I'm not going to say any more, but like, your dog, for a lot of people, I've got a dog who I absolutely, love. Let's say I'm very devoted to my dog. But I also understand that, I'm not kind of projecting a theory of mind onto the animal. My dog doesn't have, and this is where my faith actually is quite helpful in differentiating what is a person versus an animal who, again, I may have strong feelings about, but she doesn't have a concept of justice. She doesn't have a concept of reason. She doesn't have a concept of love. She has concepts of kind of dependency, which appears to me like loyalty. She's evolved a mechanism to, like with her eyes, where she can kind of mimic, basically human emotion in order to get a kind of evolutionary advantage that'll make me care for her more. But she does not have, again, this kind of like, she doesn't have, I don't know, again, this is not like my world, but I think it's called theory of mind. Um, and I also, I will actually say something a bit controversial, um, related to kind of my own political views on the subject. I actually also think this is happening with very smart people to people who are kind of not as smart, where there's an assumption of a lot more complexity in the mind. And I guess I'm not, I mean, just my professional life has been, I worked in oil rigs. I was an enlisted soldier in the military. I worked in, big city public schools. I love, people who, are not necessarily kind of like Ivy League or PhD. Um, but there are kind of qualitative differences, between like basically outlook and what one is capable of even. I mean, I guess I'm scared to say what I believe to be true, what I almost know to be true, but like in a similar way that my dog is not, it doesn't even really have a concept of justice. I think there is a question about like where that even happened, where that even begins.
Yeah.
And I actually think the church has had to very controversially rule on these subjects, like where you would run into new groups of indigenous people in Africa.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's like even a question like of humanity and
Yeah.
would
It.
rule in favor of them, even in like the
Right.
sixth
Right.
and 7th century, because it's like they believed in spirits. And this is,
Right.
this
Right.
is
Well, I was gonna say it's so funny to talk about animals in this context because I was just talking about this earlier today. So shout out to my seminarian students. We were asking similar questions. Um, it only becomes Narcissan if you become like your dog, though.
right.
So
And some
it.
people do. There are like
Yeah.
bizarre
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
treating the dog like the child, and it's like, wait a minute, I don't want to be a jerk here, but that's not what this is.
Well, yeah. I don't. But I don't. I don't know. I don't know a whole lot of people who, in seeing consciousness or something, some diminished form of consciousness in their dogs, um, leave. I mean, maybe a particular. I don't see a lot of people failing to have like believing that they are irrational and that they
Oh,
and
I
that
see.
they don't have a concept of justice because
Oh, I see. I see.
that's that
Actually, I'll give you an example. Did you see the Tiger King documentary?
yeah. So those sorts of outliers are totally there, but I don't think that's most people
And
with
I'm not
most
talking about the
dogs.
Tiger King himself, but that other guy who had the long hair and had like the kind of multiple wives, and like I was like, this guy.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I haven't seen the yeah. Okay, there you go. There you go. Yeah, that would be an instance of the narcissism where you turn into what you
Yeah.
think is conscious, but I don't know. Animals might have some sort of diminished form of
But I
something.
do think you have with animals where like it's like artificial intelligence. There's this appearance of, and also there's on our end there's a confusion of just intelligence. Like my dog, I've got an Australian Shepherd. It's quite a smart dog compared to other dogs I've ever had. Where she understands if I pick up like my little bag, she knows to go to which
Ah,
door to go
yeah.
to if I'm going to the base, and she knows if I get which shoes mean I'm staying inside versus going outside or going to the car. Like
Right. Right. Yep.
I had other dogs that like have no, absolutely not sorting those things out. And I think there is an association by some of us, like where that kind of intellect, as it were, even though I don't think that's what that is.
Oh, but they totally do. They totally have some sort of again diminished
but
quantitatively, yeah.
but is that personhood? And I think like the church, in my view, like kind of correctly as ever, if you read the catechism, kind of, is able to say, but no, that's not what personhood is. Not just computational power. It is all of these kind of immaterial things. It's this
Right.
conscience. I'm sorry, the conscience is kind of that echo of God's word. I think. And I
Oh
wrote
yeah. Yeah, they don't have yeah. Theologically speaking, I have a question for Han, but like theologically speaking, they don't have God didn't breathe the breath of life into animals, so there's something different going on there. But they have something. They surely there's a great article.
Into and when a human does these things, it's like a failure.
Yeah.
There's been something occluded.
I was curious, Han, more because to learn more about how you're approaching this more broadly too. Um, like, do you think that the AI is a threat? Your competition image is I think very. I don't know if it's complete, but that would be a different conversation. But I think there's a lot of captures. Do you think it's a threat to us because we are being threatened by basically not ASI, artificial superintelligence, but it's just better than we are. But that we are the competition is still between basically computational agents. In other words, is it it's going to have higher capacity, maybe it has consciousness, maybe it doesn't, but we are the same sort of thing as these engines in some sort of material way. And so the competition really is we've out updated ourselves. We've made something better than we are, but we're the same kind of thing. If that makes sense.
I think that's a one way that you could frame the argument, and I think that captures the gist of what I'm saying. Yes. So the scenario that I described does not require artificial superintelligence. It doesn't require a scenario where the machine's relation to man is like God's relation to man, as it were, right? It just requires that maybe you can spin up a 130 IQ LLM agent for $5 an hour, no, a dollar, like 10 cents an hour, right? I think, if anything, that seems like the more likely kind of nearer term scenario within, let's say, the next 5 or so years, rather than this kind of runaway recursive self improving system. But again, so much hinges on how much better these agents be, or how much better the technology becomes, and how quickly it becomes better. As an interesting tangent, though, the problem of animal suffering for theism has always interested me, and I can't recall ever really reading a satisfactory, or what I felt to be a satisfactory explanation, for that. Um, and I not to digress too much, but I certainly am curious, since I'm speaking to two learned men in that regard. I know, Alvin Plantinga, as I recall, became like the sort of, he, as I understand it, he's the guy who made the free will defense for the problem of evil. He's the guy who popularized that. That, if I understand correctly, has become the primary apologetics response to the problem of evil. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not up to date on that. But animals certainly seem like a kind of problematic, data point in that.
You're muted again.
Oh yeah, because I finished my point. Did I cut myself off when I muted it, or?
I don't. It sounded like you're in the middle of a sentence, but no.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You want to respond to that, Charles? I can respond too, but you can go ahead, Charles.
Well, I think this is a great question. I don't know if you've read the two things that come to mind immediately on Plantinga. The other topic on suffering, it doesn't deal with animals, but just the best answer to suffering that I've found is by Eleanor Stump. The book title is Wandering in Darkness. It's a nice door stopper though. It'll you don't have to read all of it, but it's quite hefty, and she's probably the best living analytic philosopher today for my money. She has a very fine point on animals. Um, if I'm not mistaken, C.S. Lewis has a good essay, at least, if not a book dedicated to animals, and he deals with their suffering. It's been a while, so I couldn't regurgitate his piece. There's a fantastic long form essay in the New Atlantis years and years ago on elephants and whether elephants have consciousness. Um, it's the argument in the case in the article is that they have something. They have to have something. And one of the images just burned into my brain is there was this elephant in a circus, and it was the trainer was just like whipping it to learn how to balance on a ball. So the elephant's going up, doesn't balance, falls down, pushed back to the ball over and over and over again. And at one point, he falls from the ball and can only be described as having a mental breakdown. It weeps tears. It makes elephantine versions of like wailing. Just falls on the floor like a 6-year-old who can't, you know, catch a ball or something. Just like absolute. And the reviewer, the author is just like there is something to sympathize with here. There absolutely has to be. So I don't know if I don't know quite how to describe it. I think Hart has a hardcore. It's like, well, they just definitely and but for myself, they have to have something, and I don't think it's not actually analogous to AI at all. It actually is analogous to what we possess. It's just a diminished form, a sort of uh, yeah, it's the same sort of qualia, but it's maybe a different species. I don't know. So I think that yeah. So when they suffer, there is. It's not like if animals only reply to sort of pain stimulus with like a move away from pain, that'd be one thing. But it's the sort of emotional aspects of the way that they suffer and the way that they respond to things. Like there are plenty of examples where they are reacting with what can only be described as some sort of semi-emotion or yeah like as in like a half emotion or some analog to what we possess, but
Well,
that's my
by the
take.
way, the question is if that those mechanisms have been evolved so that when we view them, we see ourselves in them. The question of whether or not the animal is experiencing it is kind of not settled. It's that they express something that looks like ours, right? At least in the case of like dogs, is it possible that that's been evolved in order to gain favor? You know what
I
I'm
mean
saying?
you can there's absolutely something. I'm happy if there's some sort of evolutionary principle at play. um I'm just not satisfied if it's reducible simply to that.
No, yeah, yeah. I mean, so I'll say there is a good book on this that I've listened to by a guy named Matthew Scully, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, I believe, and he's a vegan Christian, and the book is called Dominion. It's worth, but it's actually a pretty uncomplicated answer. The answer is these guys going out and hunting elephants and this big game hunting in Africa, obviously ridiculous, obviously indulgent, and just like not like a Christian pastime. And then people kind of just like abuse of animals is also these are just kind of obvious sins if you're torturing and abusing animals. So clearly, don't do that. The harder question becomes um, the kind of industrial slaughter facilities, and he is very, it becomes like, you've got a small family farm and you slaughter a pig, whatever, once every couple months. That's one thing, but these facilities are basically amount to torture. And I think he's making a Christian argument that it's inappropriate. We have a dominion. The point of the book is, the title is Dominion. We have dominion over, in this biblical sense, like the creatures that crawl on the earth and fly in the sky, or whatever the original language is. And part of that is a responsibility, a kind of stewardship. And, I think that's, anyone with a clearer conscience, I think, comes to that, a normal kind of healthy, but well-adjusted psychology comes to that conclusion. And then that has, maybe radical implications for the way you eat and the way that you relate, to society. At the same time, this food system that has been able to produce so much kind of abundance is also reducing human suffering. And so there is an economic calculus, but it's not. I don't know. I don't think it's a super complex problem. It just comes down to don't torture animals, and then whether or not these Smithfield facilities housing these very poor, beleaguered pigs amounts to torture is the question. And I think anyone who is able to inspect those facilities probably would come to the conclusion that it is torture. My wife won't let me buy Smithfield pork.
Yeah, interesting. There's some more stuff there I'd love to explore, but I don't want to derail the conversation from the topic at hand.
I don't care. Yeah, let's do it.
This conversation for the podcast is actually kind of right in the vein. Doomer optimism is kind of about, how do we reclaim a kind of, a normal relationship with ourselves and our communities, like from this enormous system. So especially industrial slaughter facilities, I'm sure there's a lot of people wondering about that.
Yeah, derail.
Yes. Okay, so one of the reasons I find the problem of animal suffering interesting is because it intersects with a couple of things. It intersects with the hard problem of consciousness. It intersects with biology. It intersects with notions of moral worth as a function of sort of the level of consciousness that a sentient being has. And of course, it intersects with theology because, you need a theodicy to account for why God would permit, 80 billion animals a year to live a life of torture in a slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
And the reason I mentioned I don't know how to say this guy's name, Plantinga, I'm not sure. The reason Plantinga's free will defense is inadequate as a theodicy for the problem of animal suffering is because, of course, animals don't have free will. And so it begets the question of why, if these are conscious agents, conscious beings rather, and if, according to many biologists or neuroscientists, a pig is approximately as smart as like a very young child or something like that, right?
More than dog.
So yeah, and obviously the pig is not going to see salvation or accept, Christ or etc. Right? So what, why are we permitting basically, or like why would a benevolent God permit, this kind of like rolling Holocaust for the equivalent of a 3-year-old child instantiated in a quadruped, right? And I have to say I've not encountered a satisfactory response for that. I think it's a broader problem in terms of, land has a very simple explanation for this, right? Which is that the world is basically hell, and we're genetic survival monsters, so I guess more precisely that's what I'm curious about. So I don't know if I actually no comment. No comment.
Oh, Nick's Land. Yeah.
I haven't read
but,
it yet.
Yeah, so I don't know, Charles, if Eleanor Stump talks about this particular theodicy in her book. I'd be curious about that. I have read. I wish I was, a young man still, and I could read these very, like 20-hour books or what have you. But
dude,
I'd be curious if maybe you could tell.
20 hour, more like
well,
80
hours. On that, I just to throw myself into the crowd that no one likes. I landed the perfect time in my life to read Infinite Jest, which I deeply love. But like I look at it now, I was suggesting it to a friend, and he was like, "There's no way I'm reading that. Like, you can forget it." Um,
How
oh
many
man,
words is your novel, Han?
I think it's about 90K.
100,000? Yeah.
Yeah, it's about
okay,
90. Yeah.
okay,
And then what
nice.
do you think Infinite Jest is like almost a million or something?
Oh, it's yeah, it's
Oh man, I think it's. I remember reading it. It might be 600,000, but I think that's low. I think it is. I think it's
yeah,
closer to a mil. Yeah.
yeah. Ah, it's such a okay. So the
577,608 words.
goodness gracious. You talk about like aperiodic writing real fast. Like that's a great example. So Stump doesn't talk about well, she doesn't talk about she doesn't like have a section dedicated to like now to animals. Um I mean in a way like the any theodicy worth its salt uh sort of like looks at any sort of suffering. So like we could, for the DO crowd, right? You could say same thing, same question, but same question, but the land, same question, but plants, same question, but rivers. Say things that we don't even have any pretense that there's something conscious at all at play, but there's something still clearly uh, worthy of some sort of respect, worthy of some sort of attention and care, and we just don't give two figs about. So, I mean, this is not going to be satisfying, but I'm trying to. I haven't thought about animals in particular, if only because I've thought about like all the things, if that makes sense. Like, why did God allow the whole slaughter bench of history? Why did he allow that to happen? Like, at every single level of sentience and sort of animation, right? That would be like that'll be the answer, and then it sort of like whatever's being written on it. It has to address all of those. Um, I don't know if there's a. I might have to think for a second before giving a satisfying like summary of that sort of answer. Besides, Hart did write a book long ago, and there's a lot of other guys who've written on this. The a nutshell is sort of at the end, uh, all sorts of evil, all kinds of evil, um, will be rejected with a hammer and remedied. That doesn't answer the why did it take place, and that has to do with sort of um yeah, I don't have a satisfying answer to like when, like why is it happening still, all of that. um but the sort of end times is a place uh
Listen,
where evil, like the evil will have evil will get the hammer, and everything will be amended. And sort of going to animals, a fun debate with like Dominicans and stuff is like, all right, when everything comes back, uh that dog, my favorite dog who, was killed by, a tree
oh,
falling on it or something. Do I get my dog back? And
the answer I think is
I'm
no.
of the yes party, and I
I
assume
hope it's
Travis
yes.
is.
I
Yeah.
actually think the answer is, at least from the Catholic Church, I think the answer is no. And I think they don't talk about it as much because it's just not popular. People love their dogs, but the bottom line is what makes you human is your conscience, and your reason. These are the two
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Animals don't have them. As much as I love and the more I like develop in my faith, the more I kind of come from a more almost a kind of pagan kind of nature worship, like not quite Paul Kingsnorth level, but I was much more of a person who spent a lot of time in the forest, and the more I become a kind of a Catholic and understand its teachings, maybe I'm just adopting the frame. But to me, there is a meaningful difference between my dog and my son, or my dog,
Yeah.
or my dog and myself. It's like, like a horse doesn't have reason, which is why you can't explain to a horse that's broken its leg, stop kicking your fucking leg or else I've got to shoot you, right? That
Sure.
it can't communicate that, and it can't understand that. And therefore, anytime a horse breaks its leg, you have to just kill it.
Right.
Same thing with the dog. I cannot explain.
Yeah. Right.
I can't explain. Do not kill this little bunny. Do not kill this thing. That's wrong, right?
Yeah. Said
So,
contra, the thing that makes you a human is your consciousness. Other things too, perhaps. The thing that the thing that makes you are your relationship with other things. So it depends on if you think the time after is denuded of certain relationships, stripped of certain relationships or not. I think that we'll be surprised that at the other end of things we will recognize what's around us because it's been returned instead of every connection we've made or our memory wiped of having a dog. I just can't imagine. I can't imagine a world afterwards where there's not some sort of pain that I will never see my dog again. That's what makes me
I
me.
absolutely love my dog. I love my animals.
Yeah,
I grew up with a million dogs. Like, I've got chickens. I love animals.
yeah. I don't think that's at least my version of this whole thing, hon. I'm not happy to say it, but I just out of technical observation, I don't think I gave you a satisfying answer. But that's a sort of beginning is sort of what's the quality, what's the status of evil at the end, and one answer is whatever. There is no evil at the end, which cannot be absolutely just kicked out the door, and the consequences of which cannot be remedied in some way.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, we're not here to debate it. So we're here to explore, ground, and I didn't mean to pin you down in that respect.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to be, I wanted to be
Yeah.
like, intellectually honest too. That you asked a
Yeah.
very good question, and so, anyways.
So maybe one more thing to get, I'd be interested to hear both you guys talk about is, I presume that Charles, you do not believe that consciousness, I'm sorry, is not just simply an emergent property. It is, kind of a divine thing. And then Han, I don't want to presume, but I'm going to guess that you do believe consciousness is a kind of emergent, kind of goes from the machine kind of thing, right? Um, I don't know. I like Charles. Do you maybe want to begin like kind of representing your opinion, or maybe Hart's opinion on this subject? And I'd be interested to hear Han kind of respond to if he's ever thought about, how does this happen?
Yeah, so I don't buy materialism. Materialism is it just doesn't work. Um, it just doesn't work. And that's yeah. So if
Why
any
not?
view that sort of takes um that gives matter the capacity to produce something which it can't, which it's not of the same kind. So like consciousness or consciousness is uh not material. So there's like there's just a sort of like causal, you can't cause what you don't have sort of issue. Um, yeah, so I mean, matter is here. Hart has, I might not spoil it, but Hart has an interesting theory on what matter is, but but it's at the very bottom, everything is mind for Hart, and I would, this is just like a classic Neoplatonic view that everything fundamentally is mind, even matter. The rock, its turtles all the way down, and that those turtles are mind would be sort of a short way of putting it for me.
And Han, do you have a kind of concept of, this is probably an impossible question, but like this emergence, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, well, it's one of my favorite topics as a hobbyist or dilettante to get into. So actually, it was the hard problem of consciousness, as articulated by David Chalmers,
Mm.
that got me into reading analytic philosophy and academic philosophy when I was younger. And for the record, uh, I myself am not a materialist. So, so I agree with Charles at a broad level here. And my arguments against this particular book and the arguments made therein, uh, vis-a-vis LLMs or whatnot, or my critique there, it has nothing to do with my general position, which is that I actually, if I were to pick one school of explanations, I would say I think I strongly lean towards panpsychism. Panpsychism, I think. Now, I am not, for the record, I am also not a theist, just for the sake of clarity around the discussion. So I'm not a theist, but I am a panpsychist, which is sort of it's a position you can take. Maybe it's not the most common position because typically atheism and eliminative materialism will go together, right? Typically, if you're talking to somebody like a Daniel Dennett, he's saying consciousness is an illusion, which to me is a contradiction in terms, right? It just makes no sense at all. Like I would sooner believe some form of idealism than I would believe in a self-negating proposition like the idea that consciousness is an illusion. That's just ridiculous to me. It's that to me is like a perfect example of the failure mode of academic philosophy, where you could really kind of just word sell yourself into just shit that is completely fucking retarded to pardon my French. Right? Yeah, right.
In your book, you talk about panpsychism being associated with Final Fantasy VII. I'd like you to get to that too.
Please.
Yeah.
That's a turn I was not expecting, but I want. Yeah.
Yeah, that was sort of just like a joke from like some vaguely recollected fond childhood memories of playing that game. Yeah. So there's this concept of the life stream in Final Fantasy, where I think it's kind of just this like vague neo-Buddhist model of uh, I don't even know really, but the idea that you have some spiritual energy that dissipates, but then it joins like some broader stream of life, and your consciousness merges with some super conscious universal entity or something. But the I think the simplest argument, basically, it's really just qualia, right? I think there's just no satisfactory, like the Mary's room, I think, is a very strong argument. And then I think Chalmers wrote the piece that stands out to me best. His paper on the heart problem, it's like 48 pages or something, like it's about 50 pages or so. And I have just never ever been persuaded by pure materialism. It just doesn't make any amount of sense. I mean, if anything, I think we live in a sort of derealized kind of world where it's almost in many ways surreal and dreamlike on a continuous basis. Like we've untethered from this feeling of everything is so heavily mattered, as it were. So I think the salient question for the trio of us is whether or not the fact of consciousness, which I take as a brute fact, uh, is itself a sufficient argument for theism. And this was a topic that interested me as well for a number of years. And then I do think it's one of the stronger arguments for theism in general. It doesn't quite get me there myself, but I can see why it would be very persuasive.
Do you remember if you remember my review of your book, not that I am the authority here, but at least my understanding is, the theist claim is actually not just consciousness, but within consciousness, the conscience. You have on the one hand, if you work in a school or something, you see a kid getting bullied, your perception of that being wrong, it could be socially, a kind of socially conditioned response. B, maybe a kind of genetically, an evolved response to save your species or whatever. or C, this, basically our view is this is a native morality that's basically implanted into your conscience, your consciousness, and that is where God resides, basically. And so I've kind of evolved into that third position, but I wonder, what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple concepts here that get fused together, right? So I would say having a conscience, yes, I agree, that's contingent on being a conscious being. I would think, right? Because there's this quality of, say, guilt. What does it feel like to be guilty? It's hard to imagine a non-conscious system that has a conscience, because morality is contingent on consciousness, because only conscious agents can have a moral value. So to have any sort of moral value, you need to have consciousness, because I would argue that the basis of moral value is effectively is your sort of capacity to suffer and to have experiences, right? Uh, the question as to whether or not the human conscience is a sufficient argument for theism, that is not persuasive to me. I think it's there are much more parsimonious explanations, and I think
Like,
my
I'd be interested to hear like, where do I go to find those?
yeah, well, you can just read psychology literature about why people think that has evolved over time, right? And it's
Oh
some
yeah.
mix
Oh,
of
so there's
yeah,
kind of just an evolved response. Yeah, no, okay.
yeah. I think there's a natural. So, like, are these
Evolution.
explanations complete? Yeah, they're not totally satisfactory, right? Like, extreme altruism seems to be in part like a problem for evolutionary psychology, to at least to an extent. At least intuitively, it seems hard to explain, right? But I, I think my main problem with an argument like that basically is that it really uh, I think it takes a lot epistemically to go from here's some feature of human psychology to okay, and now this is evident. This is
Yeah,
an
evidence.
argument
Oh
for
yeah.
omnipotent, invisible
Sure.
being,
Sure.
right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Um, just to continue, so I think that's perfectly reasonable, appropriate response there. I do wonder so this is moving away just towards kind of proof of God. This is something, so I'm 39 years old, and I've only really kind of allowed myself to embrace these things in the last, I don't know, 5 years, let's say. But certainly when I had a much more evolutionary kind of psychology, evolutionary cycle. I don't know how to put this. And when my perspective was more informed by evolutionary psych, let's say, I dismiss these kinds of things out of hand. But at least in the Catholic Church, there are a number of what we regard as miracles that have been witnessed by at least, let's say, the miracle of the sun that happened at Fatima in Portugal in like 1913 or something like that. I think there's something like 40,000 witnesses, um, like many of whom were not believers, many of whom were communists, many of whom were skeptics, and they were led to this hillside by three children that were seeing apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Um, if you do read about these kinds of things even in recent history, like ongoing now, they're happening everywhere all the time, and the people who are experiencing them, like they're not like so. For instance, in Medjugorje, in I think it's Croatia, or it's like right on the coast there, or Yugoslavia or something like that. Um, I mean, there were three children that were having apparitions every day at the same time for a period of years, and they were able to put these children under, like, while they're having the apparitions, like every day at 5 o'clock or something like that, and they were able to. I mean, you have neuroscientists are able to kind of kind of hook them up to tests and nodes and whatever. I don't know what the devices are. They were able to measure these things. It's like they're completely studied. There's a guy who wrote a book on this, who was a journalist for Rolling Stone, who was a secular American who converted to Catholicism in the course of researching the book. One of the things that's interesting is when the church isn't, I don't know if you know about the church's kind of the rigor around investigating these things, but they are ruling these things out for almost any reason whatsoever. There's the stakes are the humiliation associated with these supernatural events is like it's like basically not worth the PR for the Catholic Church. They don't want to look like fools. But there are some, and so they're ruling out things that in my view are probably real all the time because it doesn't really harm them. But there are, I mean, the examples of for instance, healings are it's shocking. It's not just, oh, I had stage 4 cancer and I've now gone into remission. It's like, I had a leg, like a disfigured leg that didn't even have muscle growth. There's no reason I should be able to walk. And in an instant, muscles develop and return. And these things are completely documented. And probably there are, from this century alone, there's probably thousands of these that are documented. The ones that are just happening, just kind of like, old woman at a holy well curing blindness kind of situation, which it's just like some crazy old lady. That kind of thing is probably happening even more frequently. So, I know a lot of people, are basically very skeptical of these things. But one thing, again, as I've kind of developed in faith is being kind of more comfortable with these kind of just blatantly kind of supernatural things. And maybe, Charles, I don't know if you have any experience with this kind of thing, but that to me, that's the proof.
I was more interested in I got myself in trouble in a conversation once when we were talking about fairies, as one does, and I said I would much prefer to encounter. I would prefer if I had the option to encounter a demon and not a fairy. And everyone's like, "This is hate. Like, why would you even, challenge the demons this way?" I was like, "Well, demons, you know it to, they know the code. Like, you can call on Christ, you can do all these things. Fairies don't give a fig. Like they're doing their own thing." Um, but I sadly haven't encountered a fairy. I would not like to encounter a demon. Let the higher powers that be very
What have you had in
clear
your
that.
own in your own prayer life? Have you ever felt like maybe like healed of like a psychological like hang up, or like have you ever had like has prayer ever kind of changed your life in a way that you feel like is meaningful?
Yeah, the miraculous is I don't have too many anecdotes. I have one time in when I was very young, maybe like 10 or something, uh like I knew there was a presence in the room. It's hard to it's one of those things where it's hard to describe, but know it when you see it, but also you never want to know it when you see it. It's just strange. Like there is another entity in the room, can't
Mhm.
explain why. And I did this sort of precious but powerful. I just grabbed my Bible and slept with it. Like I just curled up like it was my teddy bear. Um, but yeah, besides that, I was if we could go back real fast to what Han was saying about panpsychism.
Mhm.
Uh, I'm also panpsychism is kind of in vogue a little bit. So there's a lot of guys who are going for it, and I would tweak my view a little bit. There's the popular position on panpsychism is okay, fine. Um, Materialism might be dumb, so we're gonna solve it this way. Matter is fundamental, uh, but it also has this consciousness feel to it. It just has consciousness as a sort of feature as part of matter, and I don't think that works. We don't have time to get in why, but basically, I don't think matter is has the causal props to instantiate or sort of support consciousness. but you're only one step away from being a theist if one is interested in panpsychism. And that is just to reverse the trajectory, to say that everything is it's mind that is supporting matter everywhere, and not the reverse. The materialist panpsychism is materialist usually because it says it still is matter all the way down fundamentally. But if you just reverse the position and say mind is supporting matter everywhere, it's fundamentally mind at the bottom, then you believe in some sort of mind. Like there is a mind out there that is supporting and holding everything up, and that doesn't send you into one camp or the other. But that's, if one wants to avoid materialism, that seems, and one is into panpsychism, that seems a simple switch, and also the non-material position to take on panpsychism. I don't have too much to add on the consciousness, the conscience aspect from more than what Travis mentioned, but I just wanted to mention that on the panpsychism, because I also I flirted with panpsychism. It's a cool concept. Psilocybin might endorse, there's definitely something consciousness. Consciousness is everywhere, but what's the ground of consciousness, sort of?
Yeah, well, there's a number of very interesting threads there. I'm not. I might have lost myself on the question as I was following the threads, but I'm happy to kind of expand on those points. Yeah. So I like, how close does the rejection of materialism get you to theism? And that's one question. And I think the answer is it sort of depends. I think it certainly gets you closer. I completely agree it gets you closer. Uh, I don't think it's necessarily enough. And I think what happens is you end up kind of colliding with other foundational questions like the problem of suffering and things of that nature. So I don't think I think it's necessary but not sufficient to bring you to theism. And there are, notable academic philosophers. I'm a big fan of Philip Goff, Goff. Huge fan of this guy. I think he does great work. Yeah. But yeah, it brings you quite a bit of the way. Something like idealism is an interesting thing to think about, and it's. I think it's a very Gnostic sort. Obviously, it's a very Gnostic sort of view, and I've never really connected with that kind of sentiment of sort of everything is a simulation. Although I think it's an interesting thing to think about, but it seems I what I like about panpsychism is not that is actually that this may be a misinterpretation, but my view is that it situates matter and consciousness as equally fundamental. So there's this. It's like basically there are like these mirror planes of one another, where each particle of matter has a unit of, say, proto consciousness, and then in panpsychism you have this problem called the binding problem, where why is it that human brains are conscious in the way they are, and so you have to create an answer for that sort of thing. But look, a lot of philosophical arguments at the end of the day, they terminate on a foundation of very deep intuitions that we have about reality.
I agree with
intuitions that are, not really empirically testable. And that being the case, I think a lot of the reason that different arguments have different adherence is simply because some people have stronger intuitions that align with some axioms from theory A, and then other people have strong intuitions that align with axioms from theory B. And it's not so easy then to kind of, you can't run an experiment there, right? Because you're basically colliding with, these sort of
preference
pseudo personality traits. Yeah. So that's my answer to that question.
Well, real fast, what name would you give to the sort of, you're not like non-materialism, but also non-theism?
Well, I think you could just call it. I think you could just call it panpsychism, and then you just say you'd be an atheist panpsychist. That's how I would frame it. So just not a theist, and you're a panpsychist.
But you do, but mind is mind is fundamental though. So you
exactly, yeah.
So it's a mind, but it's not a god because there's not a religion or like that. That's part of where I'm.
Yeah. So the idea is that there isn't this one omnipotent, omnibenevolent supermind that precedes the kind of like. So basically, you need to arrange the particles in a certain way such that the mental properties bind into a unified consciousness, and because the universe isn't structured like a giant brain, there is no God or in that respect. But to make it a little more complicated, there's this thing called teleological or I think it's called cosmopsychism. So it's the idea that the universe as a whole is conscious, but not in the traditional sort of, say, monotheistic agentic way, but that it sort of brings about its own naturalistic evolution at certain points. And so this is what Philip Goff argues. It's a really interesting idea. He writes about it in a book called Why, with a question mark. Very, very fascinating idea, but it's funny to me how academic philosophers all seem to converge eventually on schools of thought that seem to broadly mirror ancient religious traditions, whether they be Eastern or Western. And so that's very fascinating to me. That, you've got this British guy writing in the 2020s about cosmopsychism, and it seems remarkably similar to something like Buddhism or the live stream in Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah. All the Gnostics in the back there are like, we're so back.
That's right. That's right.
I think there just aren't that many options, ultimately. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think we should probably wrap up here, but does anyone feel like we've left anything unsaid?
This was great.
Yeah, I had a great time, guys. Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for being the foil. This podcast is ultimately about, it's called doom or optimism. So I think, that sense of doom that it feels like we're going to lose, as it were, against the kind of soulless techno juggernaut. But there's maybe reasons for hope at the same time. And I think that's kind of been what we've been talking about to a large extent.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This was awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to sign off. And until next time.
All right. Cheers.
All right. Take care, guys.